Welcome back to another epic journey through history. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune the medieval world ever witnessed. A story of strategic brilliance, religious fervor, and one man's relentless determination to change the course of history. Picture this. It's July 4th, 1187. The barren hills near the village of Hattin, just west of the Sea of Galilee, shimmer with heat. Thousands of Crusader knights, the most feared warriors of their age, men clad in chainmail and white crosses, are dying of thirst. They've been lured into a trap. Around them, Muslim forces set fire to the dry grass, and smoke chokes the already desperate Christians. Their horses are dying. Their morale is shattered. And watching from a nearby hill, calculating every move with the precision of a chess master, sits Saladin, the Kurdish warrior, who will in a matter of hours destroy the most powerful Crusader army ever assembled. But how did it come to this? How did the seemingly invincible Crusader kingdoms, which had dominated the Holy Land for nearly a century, fall to this one man? The Crusaders had conquered Jerusalem in 1099 in a bloodbath that shocked even the medieval world. They had established 4 powerful states across the Levant. They had repelled multiple Muslim attempts to dislodge them. They had the finest heavy cavalry in the world, castles that seemed impregnable, and a constant stream of reinforcements from Europe. Yet within a decade of rising to power, Saladin had reversed nearly a century of Crusader dominance. He recaptured Jerusalem. He reduced the mighty kingdom of Jerusalem to a few coastal cities. He forced the kings of Europe to launch the Third Crusade and then fought them to a standstill. This is the story of how he did it. This is the story of military genius, political acumen, and the weakness of a divided enemy. This is the story of how Saladin defeated the Crusaders. Chapter 1. The Fractured Kingdom. The scorching sun beats down on the limestone walls of Jerusalem as King Baldwin IV watches from his palace window. His face, still handsome despite the disease ravaging his body, shows no expression, because it cannot. Leprosy has stolen his ability to feel, and now it's stealing his ability to rule. He's only 23 years old, but he knows he's dying, and with him dies any hope of unity among the Crusader states. This is 1184, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem stands at a crossroads. To understand how Saladin will exploit the Crusaders' weaknesses, you first need to understand just how broken these kingdoms have become. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, it seemed like divine providence. European warriors had traveled 3,000 miles, overcome impossible odds, and reclaimed Christianity's holiest city. They established 4 Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. For decades, these states thrived, protected by formidable castles, fierce knights, and the divisions among their Muslim neighbors. But by the 1180s, everything is falling apart. The nobility of Jerusalem is split into vicious factions. On one side stand the moderates, the men who've lived in the East for generations, who speak Arabic, who understand that survival means occasional cooperation with Muslim neighbors. They follow Baldwin IV and his closest advisor, Reynald of Tripoli. Reynald is shrewd, cautious, and pragmatic. He knows the Crusaders are outnumbered. He knows that Saladin, controlling Egypt and much of Syria, is growing stronger every year. Reynald wants peace treaties, defensive strategies, and time. On the other side stand the hawks, the newcomers from Europe who see any accommodation with Muslims as betrayal. Their leader is Reynald de Châtillon, a man whose very name makes Muslim chroniclers' pens drip with venom. Reynald is everything Reynald is not: impulsive, aggressive, and contemptuous of diplomacy. He holds the fortress of Kerak, which controls the vital trade routes between Egypt and Damascus. And from this stronghold, Reynald launches raids that violate every truce, attack every caravan, and rage Saladin with their audacity. In 1182, Reynald does the unthinkable. He attacks a Muslim caravan during a time of truce, then follows this up with an even more outrageous plan. He attempts to launch a naval raid on the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The raid fails, but the insult succeeds beyond Reynald's wildest dreams. Saladin swears a personal oath to execute Reynald with his own hands. The Kurdish Sultan now has something more powerful than any military advantage. He has a blood oath that will drive him forward, a personal vendetta that will unite his followers and justify any sacrifice. Baldwin IV desperately tries to hold his kingdom together. Despite his deteriorating condition, his hands are clawed, his face is disfigured, and he's going blind. He personally leads armies into battle. In 1177, at the Battle of Montgisard, the young leper king achieves a stunning victory against Saladin himself, proving that the Crusaders can still win when united. But Baldwin knows this victory is temporary. He can feel his body failing, and he can see his kingdom tearing itself apart. The succession crisis makes everything worse. Baldwin has no children. His heir is his nephew, another Baldwin, but the boy is sickly and also showing signs of leprosy. Behind this child stands his mother, Sibylla, and her ambitious husband, Guy de Lusignan. Guy is everything a medieval king should look like: tall, handsome, brave in battle, and absolutely nothing a medieval king needs to be. He's a poor strategist, a worse politician, and generally despised by the nobility. Raymond and the moderate faction hate him. The military orders distrust him. But Sibylla loves him, and royal blood flows through her veins. Meanwhile, the kingdom's finances are collapsing. Maintaining the massive Crusader castles costs a fortune. The Italian merchant cities, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, grow rich on Eastern trade, but contribute little to defense. The military orders, the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, answer to no one but the Pope and pursue their own agendas. When Baldwin IV tries to raise taxes to pay for defense, the nobility rebels. When he tries to negotiate truces with Saladin, Reynald breaks them. When he tries to prevent Guy from inheriting the throne, Sibylla's tears and determination undermine him. And all the while, Saladin watches and waits. His spies bring him detailed reports of every Crusader quarrel, every succession dispute, every broken treaty. He sees a kingdom that cannot agree on strategy, cannot maintain discipline among its lords, and cannot even decide who will wear the crown. The Crusaders' greatest weakness isn't their military inferiority. They remain formidable warriors. Their weakness is political fragmentation, the poison that has destroyed more kingdoms than all the armies in history. In March 1185, Baldwin IV finally dies. He's 24 years old. For 8 years, this extraordinary young man has held his fractured kingdom together through sheer force of will, despite a disease that should have killed him years earlier. His nephew, Baldwin V, becomes king, but the child dies within a year, probably of the same disease that killed his uncle. Now there's no barrier left. Sibylla claims the crown and immediately crowns her husband Guy as king. Raymond and the moderate faction refuse to attend the coronation. Several barons come close to open rebellion. The Kingdom of Jerusalem now has a king that half the nobility refuses to recognize, facing an enemy who controls territories 3 times larger and whose forces grow stronger every month. Saladin couldn't have planned it better himself. The Crusaders have done his work for him. They've divided their own kingdom, elevated an incompetent king, and alienated their most capable commanders. The stage is set for disaster, and Reynald de Châtillon is about to provide the spark that will ignite the catastrophe. Chapter 2. Saladin's rise 25 years earlier. A young Kurdish warrior named Yusuf ibn Ayyub arrives in Egypt as part of his uncle's military expedition. He's 30 years old, the son of a minor nobleman, and nothing about him suggests he will one day become the most famous Muslim leader of the medieval period. He's a competent soldier, certainly, and reasonably well-educated in both military arts and Islamic law. But Egypt in 1163 is a political maelstrom, and young Yusuf seems destined for, at best, a respectable career as a mid-level military commander. Egypt's Fatimid Caliphate is dying. For 2 centuries, the Fatimids ruled from Cairo, challenging the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and creating one of medieval Islam's most sophisticated civilizations. But by the 1160s, the caliphs are puppets. Real power shifts between rival viziers, and both the Crusaders and the rising power in Syria Nur ad-Din circle like wolves. Young Yusuf is here because his uncle, Shirkuh, leads Nur ad-Din's expeditionary force. Their mission is to prevent the Crusaders from taking control of Egypt and to establish Syrian influence in Cairo. The politics are Byzantine in their complexity. Shirkuh and the Crusaders both respond to calls for help from different Fatimid factions. Sometimes they fight each other. Sometimes they withdraw. Sometimes they form temporary alliances. Through it all, Yusuf distinguishes himself through competence rather than brilliance. When his uncle needs someone to hold Alexandria against a Crusader siege, Yusuf does it. When diplomatic missions need conducting, Yusuf handles them. He's reliable, steady, and apparently content to serve in his uncle's shadow. Then, in 1169, everything changes. Shirkuh finally succeeds in becoming Vizier of Egypt, the power behind the Fatimid throne. 2 months later, he dies possibly from overeating, according to chroniclers who note his considerable girth. Suddenly, unexpectedly, Yusuf finds himself thrust into one of Islam's most important positions. He's Vizier of Egypt at age 31, and almost no one thinks he'll last. The Fatimid court expects to manipulate him. The Crusaders see an opportunity to strike while Egyptian leadership is weak. Even Nur ad-Din, his nominal overlord in Damascus, probably assumes he can control this junior officer. They're all wrong. Within weeks, Yusuf, who now takes the honorific name Salah ad-Din, righteousness of the faith, which history will shorten to Saladin, demonstrates a political acumen that catches everyone off guard. He begins systematically replacing the Fatimid establishment with his own men, mostly family members and Kurdish officers loyal to him personally. He modernizes the Egyptian military, reducing the Fatimid Guard and building up a professional army. Most importantly, he secures Egypt's finances, tapping into the country's agricultural wealth to fund military expansion. The year 1171 brings Saladin's boldest move yet. The Fatimid Caliph dies, and Saladin simply doesn't recognize a successor. Instead, he orders Friday prayers said in the name of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. With this single act, he ends the Fatimid Caliphate after 262 years. It's a stunning display of confidence. The Fatimids were shy, as are many Egyptians. Saladin risks serious unrest, but he calculates correctly. Most Egyptians care more about stable government and economic prosperity than sectarian disputes, and by this point, Saladin provides both. Now he faces a different problem: Nur ad-Din. The Syrian ruler is Saladin's overlord, the man who sent him to Egypt in the first place. Nur ad-Din expects Saladin to use Egyptian resources for campaigns against the Crusaders under Syrian direction. Saladin has other ideas. He begins making excuses, delaying expeditions, finding reasons why Egyptian forces can't immediately join Nur ad-Din's armies. The relationship grows increasingly tense. By 1174, Nur ad-Din is openly planning to invade Egypt and replace his 2 independent subordinates. Then Nur ad-Din dies suddenly at age 56. Saladin moves with stunning speed. Within months, he marshes his Egyptian army into Syria and claims to be protecting Nur ad-Din's his young son and heir. Within a year, he controls Damascus. Over the next decade, through a combination of military force, political marriages, strategic alliances, and occasional ruthless suppression of rivals, Saladin unites Egypt and Syria under his personal rule. He creates something the Muslim world hasn't seen in generations: a unified state that surrounds the Crusader kingdoms on two sides. But Saladin doesn't just conquer, he builds institutions. He understands that military power alone won't defeat the Crusaders. He needs economic resources, so he reorganizes Egypt's tax collection and irrigation systems. He needs legitimacy, so he patronizes Islamic scholars, builds madrasas, and positions himself as the champion of Sunni orthodoxy. He needs loyal commanders, so he distributes land grants to relatives and trusted officers, creating a network of obligation that binds the military elite to his success. Most importantly, Saladin recognizes that defeating the Crusaders requires more than just battlefield victories. The First Crusade succeeded partly because Muslim states were divided and spent more energy fighting each other than the invaders. Saladin is determined not to repeat that mistake. He systematically absorbs or neutralizes every independent Muslim power in the region. When the ruler of Mosul resists, Saladin besieges the city until its leaders submit. When Aleppo proves difficult, he negotiates, bribes, threatens, and waits for the right moment to strike. By the early 1180s, he controls an arc of territory from Egypt through Syria to northern Iraq. The Crusaders watch these developments with growing alarm. They've grown accustomed to dealing with divided Muslim states, playing rivals against each other, maintaining their position through diplomacy as much as force. Now they face something different. A single, unified power that can marshal resources they can't match. Saladin commands the wealth of Egypt, the strategic position of Syria, and increasingly, the religious enthusiasm of Muslims throughout the region who see him as a champion of jihad against the Crusaders. Yet, Saladin faces significant challenges. Unifying these territories militarily doesn't mean they're truly unified. Local governors jealously guard their autonomy. The military needs of garrisoning Egypt, controlling Syria, and confronting the Crusaders stretch his forces thin. And there's a personal cost. Saladin's health begins to suffer from the constant campaigning, the endless political maneuvering, and the stress of holding his coalition together. But he perseveres, driven by a combination of religious conviction, political ambition, and genuine strategic vision. By 1186, Saladin controls more territory than any Muslim ruler in the region for centuries. He's established a dynasty, the Ayyubid Sultanate, that will survive him by decades. He's built an army that can challenge the Crusaders in the field. And most importantly, he has achieved what seemed impossible when he arrived as a junior officer in Egypt 23 years earlier. He's united the Muslim Near East against a common enemy. The Crusaders still hold their fortified cities and formidable castles, but they're now an island in a hostile sea. And Saladin is preparing to launch the storm that will sweep over them. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. The caravan winds slowly across the desert road between Cairo and Damascus, a lifeline of commerce that has sustained regional trade for centuries. It's 1187, and this particular caravan is especially valuable spices, silk, gold, and among the travelers, Saladin's own sister returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. The caravan expects safe passage. A truce between Saladin and Kingai guarantees it. The merchants have paid their tolls, and they travel under flags that should grant them protection from any Christian lord. Then, from the heights of Karak Castle, Reynald de Châtillon's raiders sweep down. They're not interested in the truce. Reynald never is. His men overwhelm the caravan guards, seize the goods, and take the travelers prisoner. When word reaches Saladin that his sister is among the captives, his fury is terrible to behold. He immediately sends envoys to Kingai, demanding the caravan's release and Reynald's punishment. The envoys remind Guy that a truce exists, that Reynald's attack violates every agreement, that continued tolerance of such behavior makes Guy complicit. Guy knows the envoys are right. He's not a fool, just weak. He understands that Reynald is pushing Saladin toward war, and he knows Jerusalem's army isn't ready for that war. But Guy also knows he can't control Reynald. The Lord of Kerak technically owes allegiance to the King of Jerusalem, but Reynald's castle is nearly impregnable. His men are loyal to him personally, and the hawkish faction of the nobility will support him against any royal attempt to rein him in. When Guy orders Reynald to release the captives and compensate the merchants, Reynald simply refuses. What is the king going to do? Besiege Kerak while Saladin's army lurks nearby. Guy backs down, and Saladin's envoys return to Damascus empty-handed. Saladin calls his council. His emirs advise caution. The Crusader castles are formidable. A full-scale invasion will be costly, and there's always the risk that European reinforcements might arrive. But Saladin has made his decision. Reynald has given him the legal and religious justification he needs. Under Islamic law, a party that violates a truce releases the other party from its obligations. More importantly, Reynald's repeated provocations have created a situation where Saladin's reputation requires action. If he tolerates these insults, he appears weak. If he retaliates, he appears strong and justified. The political calculation is clear. Through the spring of 1187, Saladin methodically prepares for war. He summons contingents from all his territories: Egypt, Syria, northern Iraq. He calls for volunteers motivated by religious duty. His messengers travel throughout the Muslim world, proclaiming that the time has come to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. The response exceeds expectations. Warriors arrive from as far as Persia, motivated by religious fervor, the prospect of plunder, or simple loyalty to Saladin. By June, he has assembled the largest Muslim army the Crusaders have faced in decades. Estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000 men, including approximately 12,000 cavalry. Saladin understands medieval warfare's fundamental mathematics. The Crusaders' strength lies in their heavy cavalry knights in chainmail armor, mounted on powerful war horses, charging in tight formations that can break infantry lines like a hammer through glass. In direct confrontation, these knights are nearly unstoppable. But they have weaknesses. Heavy armor in the Middle Eastern heat exhausts men and horses. The Crusaders depend on water sources that are predictable and controllable. Their political divisions mean they struggle to assemble their full strength quickly. And most importantly, their forces are finite. Every knight lost is difficult to replace, while Saladin can draw on much larger population bases. The Sultan's strategy isn't to defeat the Crusaders in a fair fight. It's to create conditions where a fair fight becomes impossible for them. On July 1st, Saladin crosses the Jordan River and begins ravaging Galilee, deliberately provoking the response. His forces attack the town of Tiberias, which is held by Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Esquiva. The castle holds firm, but the town burns. Refugees flood toward the Crusader strongholds with stories of Muslim atrocities. The trap is being set. At Sephri, near Nazareth, King Guy convenes his war council. Raymond of Tripoli faces an impossible situation. His wife is besieged at Tiberias, but he knows Saladin wants the Crusaders to march to her relief. He knows the route to Tiberias crosses barren hills with limited water sources. He knows Saladin's mobile cavalry will harass them every step of the way. Despite his personal stake, Raymond argues vehemently for staying at Sephri, where water is plentiful, and the army can maintain strong defensive positions. If they wait, he argues, Saladin will eventually have to disperse his army. Medieval armies can't maintain cohesion indefinitely. The argument rages through the day. Raymond's position is sound militarily, but politically, it's untenable. How can the king of Jerusalem refuse to relieve a besieged Christian city? How can the nobility stand by while the wife of one of their own faces capture? Reynald de Châtillon argues passionately for advance. He mocks Raymond's caution, questions his courage, and hints darkly that Raymond's years of truces with Saladin have made him sympathetic to the Muslim cause. Gerard de Rydford, the master of the Knights Templar and one of Raymond's political enemies, supports Reynald. The hawkish faction sees this as their moment. That night, Gerard visits Guy's tent privately. What exactly he says, no one records, but it's effective. He probably questions Guy's courage and his right to wear the crown. He probably reminds Guy that Raymond and the moderate faction never wanted him as king. He probably suggests that a glorious victory over Saladin would silence all critics and secure Guy's throne. Whatever the arguments, they work. The next morning, July 3rd, Guy reverses his decision. The army will march to Tiberias. Raymond immediately understands the catastrophe this represents, but it's too late. The decision is made, and once a medieval army begins moving, stopping it is nearly impossible. The Crusader host leaves Sephri at dawn, approximately 20,000 men, including 1,200 knights, the kingdom's entire military strength. They carry the true cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, believed to be a piece of the actual cross on which Christ died. Its presence is supposed to guarantee divine favor. The Crusaders believe God marches with them. Saladin receives word of the Crusader departure within hours. His scouts have been watching Sephri constantly, and now they shadow the Christian army's every move. The Sultan's eyes light up when he hears they're marching for Tiberias. He immediately sends orders to his commanders. Harass the Crusaders constantly, but don't offer them battle. Shoot arrows at their flanks, then retreat before they can charge. Target their horses. Set fires in the dry grass to create smoke and confusion. And most importantly, prevent them from reaching water. Every spring, every well along the route must be controlled or poisoned. The Crusaders must arrive at Hattin exhausted, dehydrated, and desperate. The march becomes a nightmare within hours. The July sun beats down mercilessly. Men in chainmail armor, designed for European climates, feel like they're roasting alive. Muslim cavalry swarm around the column's flanks, loosing arrows, then wheeling away before the Crusader knights can respond. When the Christians do charge, their heavily armored horses quickly exhaust themselves in the heat, and the nimble Muslim cavalry simply gallops away, turns, and resumes harassing fire. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and every hour makes it worse. By midday, the army is desperate for water. Guy wants to push on to the springs at Hattin, but his men are collapsing from heat stroke and thirst. Against Raymond's anguished advice, Guy orders the army to make camp on a waterless plateau near the village of Hattin. The nearest water is at Lake Tiberias, miles away, and Saladin's army now blocks every approach. The Crusaders have walked into a trap, and tomorrow, the trap will snap shut. Chapter 4. The Horns of Hattin dawn breaks on July 4th, 1187, and it brings no relief to the thousands of Crusader soldiers who have spent the night on the dry plateau. Men lick dew off their armor. Horses, already weakened by yesterday's march, stand with heads hanging low. Some soldiers have broken discipline during the night, desperately trying to reach water, only to be cut down by Muslim patrols. The morning sun promises another day of scorching heat, and every man in the Crusader army knows they're in mortal danger. The plateau where they've camped sits beneath two hills called the Horns of Hattin because of their distinctive double-peaked shape. Normally, this would be decent defensive terrain. The heights offer visibility, and attacking uphill exhausts attackers. But terrain advantages mean nothing when your army is dying of thirst and the enemy controls every water source for miles. King Guy surveys the situation from his command position and sees his strategic options narrowing to nothing. Stay here and the army will disintegrate from thirst and constant harassment. Try to retreat to Sephri and they'll be attacked on the march, just like yesterday, but worse because now the men are weaker. Push forward to Tiberias and they'll have to fight through Saladin's entire army while already compromised. Saladin understands this perfectly. He's positioned his forces in a crescent around the Crusader position, with his center blocking the direct route to water at Lake Tiberias. His light cavalry maintains constant pressure on the Crusader flanks. And crucially, he's ordered his men to gather dry brush and set fires upwind of the Crusader position. As the morning progresses, smoke begins drifting across the plateau, adding breathing difficulty to heat stroke and thirst. The Muslim soldiers, meanwhile, have abundant water brought up from the lake. Some accounts claim Saladin's men deliberately pour water onto the ground within sight of the desperate Crusaders, a calculated psychological torment. Guy makes his decision. The army will attack toward the lake, attempting to break through Saladin's center and reach water. It's the only option that offers even a chance of survival. Reynald of Tripoli will lead the vanguard with his knights from Tripoli and Galilee. Behind him, the main body includes King Guy with the True Cross, the military orders, and the bulk of the infantry. It's a desperate plan, but desperation is all they have left. Reynald leads his cavalry down from the plateau in a thundering charge. For a moment, it seems like it might work. The Crusader knights, even weakened, remain the most fearsome heavy cavalry in the world. They lower their lances and charge in tight formation, a steel avalanche aimed at the Muslim center. But Saladin has anticipated this. His center, composed primarily of light cavalry and infantry, simply opens up and flows to the sides like water parting around a rock. Reynald's charge passes through empty space where moments before thousands of enemy soldiers stood. And then the trap completes. Before Reynald can wheel his knights around, Saladin's forces close behind him, separating Reynald's vanguard from the main Crusader body. Reynald finds himself past the Muslim lines with perhaps 100 knights, cut off from his king and the bulk of the army. He faces an agonizing choice: try to fight his way back through the Muslim army, almost certainly suicidal, or save his men by continuing toward Tyre. After a moment of terrible hesitation, Reynald makes the pragmatic but politically devastating decision. He flees the battlefield, his reputation forever stained by accusations of abandoning his comrades, even though staying would have achieved nothing except adding his corpse to the others. Meanwhile, the main Crusader army disintegrates. The infantry, maddened by thirst and unable to maintain formation, breaks away from the knights and attempts to rush toward the lake. Muslim forces surround them and begin systematic slaughter. Some infantrymen fight with desperate courage, but they're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and too weakened by thirst to sustain organized resistance. Thousands are cut down or captured within the first hour of serious fighting. The surviving knights make a fighting retreat to one of the horns of Hattin, the rocky height offering their last defensive position. Guy is here with the True Cross. The military orders, Templars and Hospitallers form the defensive corps. Perhaps 200 knights reach this position, along with whatever infantry managed to stay with them. They're surrounded by Saladin's entire army, which now numbers perhaps 25,000 against their few hundred. Saladin orders his men not to waste lives in a direct assault. Instead, he positions archers in a complete circle and begins simply shooting at the trapped Crusaders. With no cover except scattered rocks, no water, and no hope of relief, the knights can only huddle behind their shields and watch their numbers dwindle. Some try to charge down the hill, hoping to break through or at least die fighting rather than be shot like animals. The Muslim forces simply open ranks, let the knights exhaust themselves, then close in from all sides. By midday, it's over. King Guy orders the royal tent struck a signal of surrender. The knights, or what remains of them, lay down their arms. Saladin's soldiers swarm up the Horn of Hattin and take possession of the greatest prize in Christendom after Jerusalem itself, the True Cross. The precious relic, which the Crusaders believe guaranteed divine favor, is now in Muslim hands. Its capture shocks Christian Europe when news eventually arrives. How could God allow his own cross to fall to the infidels? Saladin orders the prisoners, hundreds of them, brought to his tent. He's gracious in victory, offering water to King Guy and his brother Amalric. Guy drinks desperately, then passes the cup to Reynald de Châtillon. Saladin immediately stops him. According to Arab custom, offering water grants protection, and Saladin has no intention of protecting Reynald. The Sultan personally addresses the Lord of Karak, reminding him of every broken truce, every attacked caravan, and every insult. When Reynald responds defiantly, Saladin draws his sword and strikes him down personally, fulfilling the oath he made years before. The other noble prisoners watch in stunned silence. Their spared medieval warfare includes established customs of ransom, and these men are worth more alive than dead. Guy and the other Crusader leaders will spend the next year in luxurious captivity while their families raise enormous ransoms. But the military orders receive no such mercy. Saladin considers the Templars and Hospitallers religious fanatics who will never abandon their crusading vows. Over the next few days, approximately 200 to 300 captured knights of these orders are executed by Saladin's religious scholars and volunteers, eager to strike down the Crusaders' most dedicated warriors. The strategic impact of Hattin is immediate and catastrophic for the Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem has just lost virtually its entire army in a single afternoon. The great castles remain standing, but they have no field army to relieve them if besieged. The cities along the coast have walls but few defenders. In one brilliant campaign, Saladin has eliminated the military force that protected the entire Crusader presence in the Levant. The kingdom that survived for nearly 90 years, that withstood multiple Muslim attacks, that seemed permanent despite its precarious position, is suddenly defenseless. Saladin understands what this victory means. He doesn't pause to celebrate or rest his army. Instead, he immediately begins planning the campaign that will finally achieve what Muslims have sought since 1099, the recapture of Jerusalem. The greatest prize now lies exposed and nearly defenseless. Within weeks of Hattin, Saladin's forces are on the march, systematically reducing every Crusader fortress in their path. The dominoes are falling, and they all lead to the Holy City. Chapter 5. The Fall of Fortresses. Tiberius falls within days of Hattin. Esquiva, Raymond of Tripoli's wife, surrenders the castle in exchange for safe passage for herself and her garrison. It is a mercy that will become characteristic of Saladin's approach. He understands that offering reasonable terms encourages other fortresses to surrender quickly rather than resist to the last man. The strategic calculus is simple. Every fortress that falls without a protracted siege saves Saladin's army weeks or months and keeps his soldiers fresh for the next objective. Acre, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's most important port, falls on July 10th after just 4 days of siege. The garrison knows no relief is coming. The army that might have saved them died at Hattin. When Saladin's siege engines begin pounding the walls and his sappers start undermining them, the defenders recognize futility. They negotiate surrender, are allowed to leave with their personal possessions, and Saladin gains control of the harbor that connects the Crusader kingdoms to Europe. Losing Acre is like cutting the jugular vein. The steady flow of reinforcements, supplies, and pilgrims from Europe now stops. Through late July and August, fortress after fortress surrenders. Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ashkelon, cities that seemed invincible behind their stone walls, suddenly opened their gates to avoid the horrors of a storm. Saladin's reputation for mercy encouraged this. Unlike the Crusaders who massacred Jerusalem's population in 1099, Saladin generally allows Christian civilians to leave safely or remain under Muslim rule with protected status. Word spreads quickly. Resist Saladin and face siege, mining, assault, and possible massacre if the city is taken by force. Surrender promptly and receive safe conduct. Retry continue edit and fair treatment. For garrison commanders looking at empty treasuries, thin walls, and no prospect of relief, the choice becomes obvious. But not every fortress submits easily. The great Crusader castles Karak, Montreal, Biver, and others are architectural marvels built over decades to withstand exactly this kind of assault. These aren't simple walled cities. They're concentric fortifications with multiple defensive rings, deep wells ensuring water supply during siege, massive food stores, and garrisons trained specifically for prolonged defense. The Crusaders learned castle building from Byzantine masters and improved on those techniques. A determined garrison in a well-supplied castle can hold out for months or even years, and Saladin knows it. Curragh Castle, Reynald de Châtillon's former stronghold, presents a particular challenge. Perched on a hilltop in the harsh desert east of the Dead Sea, Curragh's walls are so thick that siege engines make little impression. The garrison, now under different command since Reynald died at Hattin, has provisions for a lengthy siege. Saladin invests the castle, surrounding it completely to prevent resupply, but recognizes he cannot afford months waiting for starvation to force surrender. Jerusalem is the prize, and every week spent at Curragh is a week that allows the remaining Crusader cities to organize defense or for European reinforcements to arrive. So Saladin divides his forces, a risky move militarily but necessary strategically. He leaves contingents to maintain sieges at the most stubborn fortresses while taking the bulk of his army toward Jerusalem. It's a calculated gamble that the isolated garrisons, seeing city after city fall and knowing no relief force exists, will eventually lose heart and surrender. Meanwhile, his mobile forces' fast-moving cavalry that made Hattin possible continue sweeping through the countryside, capturing smaller fortifications and cutting off any remaining Crusader strongpoints for mutual support. The speed of the collapse stuns everyone, Muslims and Christians alike. In less than 3 months, Saladin captures more territory than the Muslims have regained in 80 years of warfare against the Crusaders. By September 1187, virtually everything except Jerusalem, Tyre, and a few isolated coastal cities and castles has fallen. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which at the start of the year controlled a substantial strip of territory from southern Anatolia to the Egyptian border, now holds only a few desperate outposts. The psychological impact on the remaining Crusader populations is devastating. Refugees flood into Jerusalem, bringing stories of Saladin's seemingly unstoppable advance. The city's walls suddenly seem less impregnable when there's no field army to harass besiegers, no relief force that might arrive to break a siege, and no supplies coming through captured ports. The civilians watch as soldiers desert their posts and flee to Tyre, which still holds out under Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad, a northern Italian nobleman who arrived just as Hattin occurred, has rallied Tyre's defense with impressive energy, turning the city into the only Crusader stronghold that seems capable of sustained resistance. But Jerusalem cannot look to Conrad for help. Tyre is too far away, too occupied with its own survival, and Conrad makes clear he's not sacrificing his garrison for a city he considers indefensible. Jerusalem's defenders number perhaps 14,000 able-bodied men, but most are civilians who have never held a weapon in combat. The city has professional soldiers, refugees from other garrisons, members of the military orders who escaped Hattin, and knights who happened to be in Jerusalem during the disaster. But they number in the hundreds, not thousands. Against Saladin's approaching army of 20,000 veterans, the mathematics of defense look grim. Yet Jerusalem's walls are formidable. Byzantine and Crusader engineers have strengthened them over centuries. The city sits on heights that make assault difficult. Multiple gates can be defended simultaneously, and the fortifications include towers positioned to allow defenders to shoot at attackers from multiple angles. Most importantly, Jerusalem holds symbolic power beyond any military calculation. This is the city where Christ died and resurrected, where the temple once stood, where David ruled, where Muslim tradition says Muhammad ascended to heaven. Every defender knows that Muslims worldwide will view Jerusalem's fall as divine vindication, while Christians will see it as apocalyptic catastrophe. The pressure on the garrison is immense, but so is their motivation. Saladin also understands Jerusalem's symbolic importance. He could bypass the city, focus on capturing the coastal ports that connect remaining Crusader territories to Europe, and let Jerusalem wither on the vine. But that would be a strategic mistake. Jerusalem is the psychological center of the Crusader presence. Its capture won't just eliminate another city, it will shatter Christian morale and possibly trigger the complete evacuation of remaining Crusader populations. Moreover, Saladin has proclaimed this campaign as jihad, holy war to liberate Islam's third holiest city. His own legitimacy rests partially on fulfilling that promise. Through September, Saladin systematically prepares for Jerusalem's siege. He brings up his siege engines from other successful campaigns. Trebuchets capable of hurling massive stones, mangonels for continuous bombardment, and wooden siege towers that allow attackers to reach the height of walls. He stocks supply dumps with arrows, stones, food for his army, and engineering materials. He positions his forces to cut off every road leading to Jerusalem, preventing any supplies from reaching the besieged and any messengers from leaving to call for help. By the last week of September, Saladin's army surrounds Jerusalem completely. The siege that will determine the fate of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land is about to begin. Inside Jerusalem, Balian of Ibelin takes command of the defense. Balian is a minor noble who happened to be in Jerusalem when Saladin approached and found himself the highest-ranking military commander present. He's competent, brave, and utterly realistic about his situation. He has too few professional soldiers, too many civilian refugees, insufficient supplies for a prolonged siege, and no hope of relief. But Balian is also pragmatic. He begins organizing the defense, methodically training civilians in basic weapons use, positioning his best soldiers at critical points, rationing food, and preparing the population for what's coming. He knows he probably cannot save Jerusalem, but he can make Saladin pay dearly for taking it. Or perhaps, if he fights well enough to impress the Sultan, he can negotiate terms that spare the population from massacre. Everything depends on what happens in the next few weeks. Chapter 6. Jerusalem besieged. September 20th, 1187. Saladin's army completes its encirclement of Jerusalem, and the Sultan establishes his command post within sight of the city's northern walls. He's chosen his position carefully north of the city, where the ground rises gently and siege engines can be positioned effectively. The defenders watch from the walls as thousands of Muslim soldiers set up camp, as supply wagons arrive in endless streams, and as massive wooden frameworks begin taking shape that will soon become the siege engines that will hammer their walls. Inside Jerusalem, Balian of Ibelin gathers his commanders for a council of war. The situation is grim, but not hopeless. Jerusalem's fortifications are strong walls 40 feet high in places, reinforced with towers every 100 feet, and with a complex system of gates that can be sealed if breached. The city has wells providing fresh water, so thirst won't force surrender as it did at Hattin. Food stores are adequate for several weeks, though the swollen population of refugees complicates rationing. Most importantly, the defenders have morale born of desperation and religious conviction. Every man on those walls knows what's at stake. Balian makes a decision that shows his pragmatic nature. He knights every nobleman's son of appropriate age, creating an instant cadre of 60 new knights. It's partly practical. He needs experienced leaders to command sections of the wall. But it's also psychological. These young men, suddenly elevated to knighthood in Jerusalem's darkest hour, will fight with special determination to prove worthy of the honor. Balian also organizes the civilian population systematically. Every able-bodied man receives a weapon and an assignment to a specific section of wall. Women and children prepare supplies, tend the wounded, and maintain morale through prayer and public display of sacred relics. Saladin begins the siege in a traditional manner, sending envoys to demand surrender. His message is clear. Surrender now, and the population will be treated mercifully, allowed to leave with their possessions. Resist, and if the city is taken by storm, Muslim law permits enslavement of the population and pillaging of property. It's a standard medieval siege demand, but Baldwin recognizes it as propaganda. Saladin wants to avoid a costly assault if possible. Every day spent besieging Jerusalem is a day his army consumes supplies, loses men to disease and desertion, and potentially gives European Crusaders time to organize relief. Baldwin responds with his own calculation. He sends word to Saladin that Jerusalem's defenders include many women and children, refugees from across the kingdom. If forced to choose between slavery and death fighting, the garrison will choose death, but first they'll destroy every Muslim holy site in Jerusalem, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a bluff, probably. Christian commanders destroying Islam's third holiest sites would unite the entire Muslim world in genocidal fury. But Saladin cannot be entirely certain Baldwin won't do it, and the political consequences of losing those shrines would be catastrophic. The negotiations have begun, even as the siege engines prepare to fire. The first bombardment starts on September 26th. Saladin's trebuchets begin hurling massive stones at Jerusalem's northern wall. The sound is terrifying, the deep creak of twisted rope and wood, the swoosh of the counterweight descending, then the crack and crash as 100-pound stones smash into ancient masonry. The walls, however, prove remarkably resilient. Byzantine engineers built them to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. Stones gouge chunks from the wall, but the fortifications don't collapse. After 3 days of bombardment, Saladin's engineers report minimal progress. The northern approach, while ideal for siege engines, leads to Jerusalem's strongest walls. Saladin makes a crucial decision. On September 29th, he orders his entire siege operation moved to the western wall near the gate of the column. His scouts report that this section, while still formidable, shows signs of older construction and possible vulnerability. It's a massive undertaking. Dismantling siege engines, moving them around the city, and rebuilding them takes days. But Saladin's army accomplishes it with impressive efficiency, demonstrating the organizational capability that makes his forces so effective. The renewed bombardment from the west proves more successful. The stones hammer a section of wall near the gate of the column, and engineers begin seeing the kind of damage that promises eventual breach. Meanwhile, Saladin's sappers used in siege warfare begin the most dangerous work of all, tunneling under the wall. They dig from covered positions, shoring up their tunnel with wooden supports as they go. The goal is to dig under the wall's foundation, pack the tunnel with combustible materials, set it alight, and cause a section of wall to collapse when the supports burn away. Inside Jerusalem, Baldwin organizes countermining operations. His men dig their own tunnels, trying to intercept Saladin's sappers underground. When they succeed, vicious hand-to-hand combat erupts in the darkness beneath the Earthmen, fighting with knives and short swords in spaces too confined for proper weapons. It's brutal, terrifying work, but it's also essential. Every Crusader tunnel that intercepts a Muslim tunnel is a section of wall that won't collapse. The siege settles into a grinding war of attrition. Every day, Saladin's siege engines pound the walls. Every night, both side sappers dig beneath them. Crossbow bolts and arrows fly between besiegers and defenders. Small sorties from Jerusalem try to destroy siege engines or disrupt sapper operations, usually at heavy cost. The civilian population grows more desperate as food supplies dwindle and casualties mount. Eastern Christian communities in Jerusalem begin quietly negotiating with Saladin's representatives, hoping to secure protection when the city falls, because everyone now believes the city will fall. On October 1st, a massive stone from one of Saladin's trebuchets crashes through the roof of a building near the wall, killing a family sheltering inside. The incident spreads panic. If the siege engines can reach that far into the city, nowhere is safe. Balian uses the moment to rally defenders, reminding them that surrender means slavery for many, that their duty is to hold long enough for European relief to arrive. But privately, Balian knows no relief is coming. He's fighting for time to negotiate better surrender terms, nothing more. The breakthrough comes on October 2nd. One of Saladin's mining operations successfully undermines a section of western wall. The sappers pack the tunnel with wood and oil-soaked materials, then set it ablaze. Hours later, with a grinding rumble that echoes across the city, a 50-foot section of wall collapses into rubble. Saladin's soldiers raise a tremendous cheer. The breach exists. The city can be stormed. Balian immediately rushes troops to the breach, building hasty barricades from rubble and positioning his best soldiers to defend the gap. He knows that if Muslim soldiers force their way through in strength, the city is lost. Street fighting in Jerusalem's narrow alleys will be chaotic and bloody, impossible to control. Everything now depends on holding the breach long enough to what? There is no relief coming. There is no strategic miracle waiting. Balian has fought brilliantly, but he's fought with inadequate resources against overwhelming force. The mathematics of siege warfare have finally produced their inevitable conclusion. That night, as fires burn throughout the besieged city and defenders huddle behind makeshift barriers at the breach, Balian makes his decision. He will negotiate surrender. Not immediate, unconditional surrender. That would result in enslavement for the population under medieval siege law. But surrender negotiated before the city is actually stormed, which might preserve some rights for the civilian population, is the best he can achieve, and further resistance will only result in pointless deaths. Jerusalem has held for 2 weeks against Saladin's full might, long enough to demonstrate Christian courage and perhaps earn Muslim respect. Now pragmatism must prevail. Balian sends word to Saladin requesting negotiations. The Sultan, who's been expecting this, agrees immediately. He has no desire for the bloodbath that storming Jerusalem would entail. His army would suffer significant casualties forcing the breach, and street fighting in a desperate city is always costly. Moreover, Saladin is thinking beyond military victory. He wants Jerusalem's capture to demonstrate Muslim mercy and justice, contrasting sharply with the Crusader massacre of 1099. A negotiated surrender serves that goal far better than a storm and pillage. The stage is set for one of medieval history's most consequential negotiations. Chapter 7. The Surrender of Jerusalem, October 2nd, 1187, evening. In Saladin's command tent, Balian of Avalon stands before the man who has just destroyed the kingdom of Jerusalem. The contrast between them is stark. Saladin confident, commanding an army that has won virtually every engagement of the campaign, holding all the military advantages. Balian exhausted, defending a city with a breach in its walls, representing a population that knows defeat is inevitable. Yet what unfolds over the next hours demonstrates that even in complete military defeat, skilled negotiation can salvage something from catastrophe. Balian opens with the threat he outlined earlier. If forced to choose between slavery and death, Jerusalem's defenders will destroy the Muslim holy sites, kill the Muslim prisoners held in the city, and then fight to the death, making Saladin's victory as costly as possible. He speaks calmly, not as a defeated commander begging for mercy, but as a practical man laying out the consequences of various courses of action. Saladin could certainly storm Jerusalem and eventually win, but it would be expensive in lives, time, and potentially the loss of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Or, Balian suggests, terms could be arranged that allow the Christian population to leave peacefully, surrendering the city intact. Saladin's initial response is harsh. He reminds Balian that under Islamic law, when a city falls after its walls are breached, the attacking army has the right to enslave the population. Jerusalem's walls are breached. The city has resisted siege. Therefore, its population forfeits the protection they might have received from immediate surrender. But Saladin is also calculating. He doesn't actually want tens of thousands of Christian slaves. They would be difficult to manage, potentially rebellious, and their enslavement would create lasting bitterness. What he wants is Jerusalem itself, the symbolic victory, and a reputation as a just conqueror. The negotiation continues through the night. Saladin's brother, Aladil, participates, along with several of the Sultan's most trusted advisors. They propose a ransom system: 10 dinars for every man, 5 for every woman, 1 for every child. Those who can pay go free, those who cannot become enslaved. Balian immediately objects. The majority of Jerusalem's swollen population consists of poor refugees who fled other captured cities. They have nothing. This proposal would result in thousands being enslaved, mostly women and children, which would tarnish Saladin's reputation, even if it's legally permissible. Balian makes a counterproposal, a lump sum payment that covers everyone. He offers 30,000 dinars from Jerusalem's treasury for the entire population's freedom. Saladin's advisors scoff. There are perhaps 60,000 Christians in Jerusalem. The per-person price Balian proposes is absurdly low, but Balian argues this is all the city can pay. The treasury is depleted from years of war. The wealthy nobles are dead, captured at Hattin, or fled. The refugees have nothing. Take the 30,000 dinars, Balian argues, and gain the goodwill of releasing a population that could have been enslaved. Refuse and face the military and political costs of storming the city. Saladin compromises. He accepts the ransom system: 10 dinars per man, 5 per woman, 1 per child, but makes significant concessions. Jerusalem's treasury will pay a lump sum covering 18,000 people. He personally ransoms 7,000 people from his own funds. His brother Aladil requests and receives 1,000 people as a gift, whom he immediately frees. The 40-day period for paying ransoms is generous, allowing time for funds to arrive from relatives and allies. Perhaps most importantly, Saladin orders his soldiers to allow the Christian clergy to leave with sacred relics and church treasures, a gesture that costs him nothing materially but earns enormous goodwill. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem formally surrenders. The agreement stipulates that Christian inhabitants can leave the city safely if they pay their ransoms within 40 days. They can take their portable possessions. They will not be harmed during their departure. In exchange, the city, its fortifications, and all military equipment becomes Saladin's property. The true cross, captured at Hattin, remains in Muslim hands. Jerusalem, lost by the Christians 88 years ago and recaptured in the bloodbath of the First Crusade, now returns to Muslim control. The contrast with 1099 could not be more stark. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, they massacred the population so thoroughly that chroniclers describe streets running with blood deep enough to splash against horses' legs. Muslims and Jews died by the thousands. The Crusaders pillaged every building, destroyed mosques, and desecrated holy sites. Now, as Muslims retake the city, the conduct is dramatically different. Saladin stations guards at gates to prevent looting. He orders the churches protected. Though they're later converted to other uses, they're not destroyed. The Christian population is allowed to organize its departure in relatively orderly fashion. But relatively orderly doesn't mean easy. The logistics of evacuating 60,000 people from a besieged city are staggering. Long columns of refugees begin the journey to the coast, hoping to reach Tyre or arrange sea passage to Europe. Many lack the ransom money and remain in the city, their status uncertain. Saladin's promise to prevent enslavement is genuine, but his ability to control every soldier is limited. Some Christians are taken as slaves despite the agreement, though in much smaller numbers than would have occurred if the city had been stormed. The Latin patriarch, Heraclius, becomes a figure of particular controversy. He pays his 10 dinars and leaves the city with wagons loaded with church treasures. Christian chroniclers later express fury that he didn't use those treasures to ransom poor Christians who remained enslaved. The image of the patriarch departing with gold while poor families stay behind in chains becomes a symbol of the church leadership as corruption. Baldwin IV, by contrast, earns respect from both sides for his dignified conduct in defeat. Saladin enters Jerusalem on October 2nd, exactly 88 years after the Crusader conquest, a coincidence that Islamic chroniclers note with satisfaction as evidence of divine will. His first act is to purify the holy sites. The Dome of the Rock, used by Crusaders as a church called Templum Domini, undergoes ritual cleansing. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, converted into a Crusader palace and stables, receives similar treatment. Saladin orders roses and rosewater brought from Damascus to wash away, symbolically, the pollution of Christian occupation. Islamic prayer returns to Al-Aqsa for the first time in nearly 9 decades. The Sultan also demonstrates religious tolerance that surprises many of his own followers. He allows the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christianity's holiest site, to remain a church. Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Armenian, and others who weren't involved in the Crusades and often suffered under Latin Catholic rule, are allowed to remain in Jerusalem under Muslim protection. Saladin understands the political value of this tolerance. It divides Christian communities, making unified resistance less likely, and portrays him as a just ruler rather than a fanatic. Within days, Jerusalem transforms. The massive cross atop the Dome of the Rock, erected by Crusaders as a symbol of Christian dominance, is torn down. Muslim scholars arrive to staff the mosques and teach in the madrasas Saladin establishes. The Crusader coat of arms disappears from public buildings, replaced by Ayyubid symbols. Yet the basic life of the city continues. Markets operate. Eastern Christians worship in their churches, and the city's diverse population begins adapting to new political realities. News of Jerusalem's fall reaches Europe by late October, carried by refugees and merchants. The reaction is shock, grief, and fury. Jerusalem lost. The holy city in Muslim hands. The true cross captured. Pope Urban III reportedly dies from the shock of hearing the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issues a papal bull calling for a new crusade. Kings and nobles across Europe begin taking the cross, vowing to reclaim Jerusalem. The Third Crusade is about to begin, bringing to the east the most formidable warriors Christendom can muster, including Richard the Lionheart. Saladin's greatest military challenges still lie ahead. But for now, in October 1187, he has achieved what seemed impossible just months earlier. He has defeated the Crusaders and recaptured Jerusalem. Chapter 8. Consolidation and Resistance. The fall of Jerusalem creates a power vacuum across the Levant. In the weeks following the city's surrender, Saladin faces a strategic choice: pursue the remaining Crusader strongholds while his army remains in the field and morale is high, or pause to consolidate control over newly conquered territories. He chooses offense. The momentum from Hattin and Jerusalem is too valuable to waste. Every day without a Christian counterattack is a day to eliminate more Crusader footholds and make any future European expedition more difficult. Ashkelon, a crucial coastal fortress south of Jerusalem, becomes Saladin's next major objective. The city holds strategic importance beyond its size. It controls the southern approaches to Jerusalem and sits on the main route between Egypt and the Crusader territories. Its fortifications are formidable, recently strengthened by Crusader engineers who recognized Ashkelon's value. The garrison, reinforced by refugees from Jerusalem and determined to avenge that loss, prepares for serious resistance. Saladin arrives before Ashkelon's walls in late October, with siege engines already being constructed from timber stripped from captured fortresses. But before the first stone is hurled, he receives intelligence that changes his calculations. Conrad of Montferrat has transformed Tyre into a rallying point for Crusader resistance. The city, perched on a peninsula with the Mediterranean protecting three sides and strong walls defending the landward approach, has become a haven for refugees, dispossessed knights, and anyone refusing to accept Saladin's victories. Moreover, Conrad's energetic defense preparations suggest Tyre won't fall easily. This creates a dilemma. Tyre is the more strategically important target, eliminating it would leave the Crusaders with no major stronghold north of Tripoli and no port capable of receiving European reinforcements. But Tyre is also difficult to besiege and impossible to fully blockade without naval control, which Saladin lacks. Ashkelon, meanwhile, is isolated and vulnerable. Saladin decides on a middle path: maintain pressure on Ashkelon while sending a substantial force to invest Tyre, hoping one or both will surrender quickly. The siege of Ashkelon proves more difficult than expected. The garrison fights with desperation born of knowing that surrender means the end of Crusader presence in southern Palestine. Saladin's siege engines battered the walls throughout November, but the defenders repaired damage each night, raid Saladin's camps, and maintain surprisingly high morale. The Sultan's patience begins wearing thin. His army has been in the field continuously since spring. Disease spreads through the camps. Some emirs begin requesting permission to return home for winter, arguing their feudal military obligations have been fulfilled. Then Ashkelon's situation becomes untenable in an unexpected way. King Guy, released from captivity after Jerusalem's fall on condition he never again bear arms against Muslims, travels to Ashkelon and orders the garrison to surrender. It's a controversial decision that many in the garrison view as cowardly or even treasonous. But Guy argues pragmatically that further resistance is pointless. No relief is coming. Supplies are limited, and Saladin will eventually take the city anyway. Better to negotiate terms now than force a storm that will result in enslaved populations. After heated debate, the garrison accepts Guy's logic. Ashkelon surrenders in early September, and its population receives terms similar to Jerusalem: ransom for freedom, with Saladin again showing mercy to those unable to pay. Meanwhile, at Tyre, Conrad of Montferrat demonstrates the kind of determined leadership the Crusader cause desperately needs. Conrad is a fascinating figure, an Italian nobleman with no prior connection to the Holy Land who arrived literally as Hattin was being fought and immediately recognized that only vigorous defense could save any Crusader territory. He takes command in Tyre through sheer force of personality and competence, organizing refugees into effective military units, repairing fortifications, stockpiling supplies, and most importantly, maintaining morale through personal example. When Saladin's forces invest Tyre in November 1187, they find a very different situation than at other sieges. Conrad has prepared thoroughly. The city's position on a peninsula makes full encirclement impossible. Saladin's army can block the landward side, but ships can still reach Tyre's harbor. Conrad maintains communication with Cyprus and other Mediterranean cities, receiving supplies and small reinforcements that keep the garrison fed and motivated. When Saladin's siege engines begin bombardment, Conrad's engineers respond with counter-battery fire, and his soldiers launch aggressive sorties that disrupt mining operations. The siege drags through December with little progress. Saladin captures Tyre's suburbs and eliminates the city's agricultural hinterland, but the fortifications prove extremely resilient. Most frustrating for Saladin is his inability to blockade the harbor. Several times, his forces attempt naval operations using commandeered ships, but Conrad's defenders sink or capture them. The Crusaders maintain maritime superiority, which means Tyre can hold out indefinitely as long as external supplies arrive. In late December, Saladin faces a crisis of command. Multiple emirs inform him their feudal obligations have expired and they must return home. The army has been mobilized for 8 months, an extraordinarily long campaign by medieval standards. Soldiers are exhausted, supplies are running low, and the winter weather makes camping miserable. Moreover, rumors arrive from Egypt and Syria of local governors growing too independent, of territories needing the Sultan's attention, of potential rivals gaining influence in his absence. Saladin cannot afford to keep his entire army at Tyre indefinitely. He makes a strategic decision. On January 1st, 1188, Saladin lifts the siege of Tyre and withdraws to winter quarters. He leaves screening forces to prevent Tyre from expanding its control, but takes his main army back to Damascus. It's presented as a temporary withdrawal. Saladin will return in spring to complete the conquest. But Conrad and the Crusaders recognize it for what it is. Tyre has survived, providing the Crusader cause with a crucial foothold and a functioning port. The Sultan's campaign, so overwhelmingly successful for 8 months, has encountered its first significant setback. The surviving Crusader territories are now minimal: Tyre, Tripoli, Antioch, and a handful of castles still holding out. But they exist, and their existence means Saladin's victory remains incomplete. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is functionally destroyed as a political entity, reduced to a government in exile in Tyre, but the Crusader presence hasn't been eliminated. And most importantly, the Crusader failure to defend Jerusalem is rallying Europe. News of Saladin's victories catalyzes the greatest mobilization of European military power since the First Crusade. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, are taking the cross and preparing to march east with armies that dwarf anything the Crusaders have fielded before. Saladin uses the winter of 1187 to 88 to consolidate his gains. He establishes Muslim governors in captured cities, rebuilds fortifications damaged during sieges, and organizes the administration that will turn military conquest into permanent control. He also faces the practical challenge of keeping his coalition together. The emirs who provided troops expect rewards, land grants, governorships, and plunder. Saladin distributes these carefully, balancing the need to satisfy supporters against the risk of creating overly powerful subordinates who might challenge his authority. The winter also brings Saladin face to face with the limitations of medieval logistics. Maintaining large standing armies is extraordinarily expensive. Soldiers must be paid, fed, and equipped. Fortifications need garrisoning. Conquered territories require administration. Saladin's treasury, enriched by conquests, is nevertheless straining under these demands. The campaign of 1187 succeeded partly because it was short and decisive months of victorious campaigning that captured wealthy cities. A prolonged war against European Crusaders will be far more costly without the compensating income from captured Christian cities. By spring 1188, Saladin faces a fundamentally different strategic situation than a year earlier. Then, he confronted a divided, weakened Crusader presence that could be defeated through decisive military action. Now, he faces the prospect of defending his conquests against European armies that outnumber anything the Crusaders could previously field. Saladin's earlier victories have solved one problem: Crusader political control of Jerusalem and much of the Levant, but created another. They've unified Europe against him in a way that decades of Crusader defeats never did. The Third Crusade is coming, and with it, some of the most formidable warriors of the age. Saladin's greatest test still lies ahead. Chapter 9. The Arrival of the Lionheart. June 1191. The beaches of Acre fill with English ships bearing the standards of Richard I, King of England, the legendary Lionheart. Richard is 33 years old, tall, red-haired, and regarded as perhaps the finest warrior in Christendom. He spent the past year traveling to the Holy Land, stopping in Sicily to settle political disputes, conquering Cyprus from a Byzantine rebel, and assembling the supplies and ships necessary for serious campaigning. Now, he arrives at Acre, where a Crusader army under Philip II of France and Guy de Lusignan has been besieging the city for nearly 2 years with limited success. Richard's arrival changes everything. To understand this moment, we need to back up 2 years. In 1189, as news of Jerusalem's fall finally galvanized Europe into action, 3 great monarchs took crusading vows: Richard of England, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick, the oldest and most experienced, departed first in May 1189, leading a massive German army overland through Anatolia. For months, Saladin received alarming reports of this vast host approaching, defeating every Turkish force sent against it, threatening to change the entire strategic balance. Then, in June 1190, Frederick drowned crossing a river in Cilicia. His army disintegrated. Some soldiers returned home. Some continued on in reduced numbers, but the coherent threat vanished. Saladin's greatest worry had resolved itself through pure accident. Philip and Richard took the sea route, departing in summer 1190, but moving slowly due to the immense logistical challenges of transporting armies by ship. They also loathed each other. Philip, the more calculating and politically astute, resented Richard's military reputation. Richard, proud and impulsive, chafed at any suggestion of French superiority. Their alliance was necessary. They needed each other's resources, but fragile, poisoned by personal animosity and conflicting ambitions. Meanwhile, Saladin faced his own crisis at Acre. In August 1189, Guy de Lusignan, freed from captivity and desperate to reclaim legitimacy, made a bold move. With perhaps 9,000 men, he marched to Acre and laid siege to the city. It was audacious to the point of absurdity. His small army was besieging a garrison while Saladin's main force, encamped nearby, effectively besieged the besiegers. Yet Guy's gambit worked better than anyone expected. His siege lines held. Reinforcements trickled in from Europe. Saladin launched multiple attacks, trying to break Guy's siege lines, but couldn't dislodge the Crusaders. The situation devolved into a brutal stalemate that consumed both sides' resources and resolve. The siege of Acre becomes a grinding nightmare. Both sides starve. Disease ravages the camps. Winter brings freezing rain that turns everything to mud. Saladin's soldiers, many from Egypt and southern Syria, suffered terribly in the cold. The Crusaders, meanwhile, faced Saladin's constant attempts to cut their supply lines. Ships bringing food and reinforcements must run gauntlets of Muslim arrows. Prices in the Crusader camp spiral absurdly. A single egg costs 6 deniers. Chicken costs 12. A sack of grain becomes worth a soldier's monthly pay. Men eat horses, then leather, then die of starvation with Acre's walls tantalizingly close. Philip II arrives at Acre in April 1191, bringing French reinforcements and fresh siege equipment. His presence revitalizes the siege. New trebuchets begin battering Acre's walls systematically. French engineers construct siege towers that allow attackers to reach wall height. The garrison fights back fiercely. They know Saladin's army camps nearby and believes relief is coming. But the walls begin crumbling under sustained bombardment. Then Richard arrives in June, and the balance shifts decisively. Richard brings not just soldiers, but expertise and energy. Within days of arriving, he's personally directing siege operations, positioning siege engines for maximum effect, organizing assaults with the precision of a continue-added experienced military commander. He falls seriously ill with Arnaldia, a disease that causes severe fever and hair loss, but continues directing operations from his sickbed, being carried to observation points on a stretcher so he can maintain command. The contrast with Philip, who is more cautious and less hands-on, becomes stark. The Crusader soldiers rally around Richard, sensing they finally have the leadership that can break the stalemate. Richard's siege engines prove devastating. He's brought superior military technology from Europe, including massive trebuchets that hurl stones larger than anything the defenders have faced. One of his engines, nicknamed Bad Neighbor by the Crusaders, systematically demolishes a key tower. Another, God's Stone Thrower, smashes breach after breach in Acre's walls. The bombardment continues day and night, giving defenders no respite to repair damage. Richard also organizes his forces more efficiently than Guy or Philip managed. He establishes clear command structures, ensures regular pay for soldiers, and maintains discipline that prevents the chaos that plagued earlier Crusader operations. Inside Acre, the garrison realizes their situation is hopeless. They've held out for 2 years, expecting Saladin to break the siege, but Richard's arrival demonstrates that won't happen. Food supplies are exhausted. The walls are crumbling. Morale collapses as soldiers watch breach after breach open in their defenses. On July 11, 1191, Acre's garrison requests terms. The negotiations reveal the complex politics now dominating the crusade. Guy de Lusignan wants harsh terms that punish the Muslims and validate his kingship. Conrad of Montferrat wants terms favorable enough that Acre's fall doesn't jeopardize his position entire. Philip wants the siege to end so he can return to France. Richard wants terms that serve English interests and his personal glory. The final agreement reflects Richard's dominance. Acre's garrison will surrender the city and all its equipment. Saladin must pay 200,000 dinars, return 1,600 Christian prisoners including specific high-ranking nobles, and return the True Cross captured at Hattin. In exchange, Acre's garrison of approximately 2,700 soldiers receives safe conduct once these conditions are met. Hostages are exchanged to guarantee compliance. It's a reasonable medieval ransom agreement, but it contains a fatal ambiguity. What happens if Saladin delays payment or disputes the terms? On July 12, 1191, Crusader banners rise over Acre's walls. The city that held out for 2 years, that Saladin personally tried and failed to relieve, that cost thousands of lives on both sides, returns to Christian control. It's the Crusaders' first major victory since Hattin. The psychological impact is enormous. The myth of Saladin's invincibility shatters. Crusader morale soars while Muslim forces, watching from Saladin's camp, see their greatest seaport lost and their most determined garrison forced to surrender. But victory brings new problems. Philip II, claiming illness and urgent business in France, announces he's leaving the crusade. He'll leave most of his soldiers under Richard's command, but his departure means Richard must deal with French nobles who resent English authority. Moreover, Philip's return to France creates political complications. Richard fears correctly that Philip will use his absence to undermine English holdings in France. The alliance that brought two great European monarchs to the Holy Land dissolves in petty rivalries barely a week after their greatest victory. Meanwhile, negotiations over Acre's ransom terms deteriorate rapidly. Saladin begins disputing details, which prisoners count toward the 1,600. What condition they must be in, whether the True Cross is actually available. Richard suspects, probably correctly, that Saladin is stalling, trying to preserve his army's strength by not releasing fighting men, and perhaps hoping the Crusaders will fall into quarreling. By early August, a month after Acre's surrender, Saladin has delivered only partial payment and a fraction of the promised prisoners. Richard faces a military and political crisis. His army consumes enormous supplies daily. The longer he waits at Acre, the more difficult any campaign to recapture Jerusalem becomes. Summer heat makes marching inland dangerous, and autumn rains will make it impossible. He needs to move soon or abandon the entire objective of the crusade. But the hostages from Acre's garrison are in his custody, and Saladin's non-compliance with ransom terms creates a terrible dilemma. If Richard releases the hostages anyway, he appears weak and encourages Saladin to ignore agreements. If he keeps them indefinitely, He must feed and guard 2,700 enemy soldiers while trying to campaign. There's a third option, one that medieval warfare permits, but that will stain Richard's reputation forever. On August 20th, 1191, after Saladin fails to meet another deadline for payment, Richard makes his decision. He orders the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside Acre's walls, within sight of Saladin's army. The massacre takes hours. Crusader soldiers systematically kill bound captives, including many who fought bravely throughout Acre's 2-year siege. Saladin's forces watch in horror from their positions, too far away to intervene, witnessing the slaughter of comrades who surrendered under promises of safe conduct if ransom was paid. The massacre at Acre is one of the Crusade's most controversial moments. Medieval warfare included brutal customs. Stormed cities could be sacked, prisoners could be enslaved or ransomed, and sometimes executed. But this killing of hostages after negotiated surrender shocks contemporaries on both sides. Muslim chronicles describe it as barbaric treachery. Some Christian chroniclers attempt to justify it as military necessity or Saladin's fault for not meeting ransom terms. Modern historians debate whether Richard acted from pragmatic military calculation, frustration with Saladin's delaying tactics, or simple cruelty. What is undeniable is its impact. The massacre ensures that the conflict between Richard and Saladin will be fought without mercy, that prisoners on both sides face uncertain fates, and that this crusade will be remembered for its brutality as much as its martial valor. Saladin's response is restrained, surprisingly so. He orders the execution of some Christian prisoners in retaliation, but far fewer than the Christians killed. He recognizes that escalating atrocities serves no strategic purpose. Moreover, Saladin is already planning his response to Richard's inevitable march toward Jerusalem. The English king has proven himself formidable, decisive, militarily competent, and ruthless. The coming campaign will test both leaders to their limits. Saladin has the advantages of interior lines, knowledge of terrain, and defending rather than attacking. Richard has superior heavy cavalry, better siege equipment, and an army burning with religious fervor and confidence from Acre's capture. By late August 1191, Richard begins his march south from Acre toward Jaffa, the first step in a campaign aimed ultimately at Jerusalem. His army numbers approximately 20,000, including perhaps 1,200 knights, smaller than Saladin's forces, but more cohesive and better equipped. Richard organizes the march carefully, maintaining tight formations that make Muslim cavalry harassment less effective. His infantry march along the coast, protected on one flank by the sea and supported by ships carrying supplies. It has a brilliant logistical arrangement that prevents the kind of disaster that befell Guy's army marching to Hattin. Saladin shadows Richard's army, looking for opportunities to attack but wary of Richard's tactical skill. The two leaders have never met in person, yet they're developing mutual respect born of recognizing each other's capabilities. Saladin knows Richard is the most dangerous opponent he's faced. Richard knows Saladin is far more formidable than the divided, incompetent leadership that lost Hattin. The stage is set for one of medieval history's most famous confrontations, a battle that will determine whether Richard's crusade can succeed in recapturing Jerusalem. Chapter 10. Arsuf and Stalemate, September 7, 1191. Near the coastal town of Arsuf, Richard's army marched south in perfect formation, a moving fortress of steel and discipline. The infantry marches in tight ranks along the coast, shields overlapping to protect against arrow fire. The cavalry rides parallel, but slightly inland, ready to charge if opportunity presents. Supply ships pace the army offshore, ensuring water and food remain available. It's a masterpiece of medieval military organization, but it's about to face its greatest test. Saladin has decided that today, the Crusader army will be destroyed. Saladin's tactical plan at Arsuf is sophisticated and draws on the same principles that won him Hattin. He knows he cannot defeat Richard heavy cavalry in direct confrontation. Crusader knights charging in formation are nearly unstoppable. But he can harass, exhaust, and provoke them into breaking formation. Once Crusader discipline collapses and knights charge individually or in small groups, his more numerous cavalry can surround and destroy them. It worked perfectly at Hattin when Guy de Lusignan's army, already weakened by thirst, lost cohesion. Saladin is betting it will work again. As dawn breaks, Muslim forces begin appearing on Richard's left flank, the landward side where his army is most vulnerable. Light cavalry archers by the thousands begin the harassment that characterized Muslim military tactics. They ride close, loose arrows into the Crusader ranks, then wheel away before the heavily armored Christians can respond. The arrows don't penetrate knight armor effectively, but they wound horses, kill unarmored soldiers, and most importantly, provoke anger. Medieval knights are trained for charges, for direct confrontation, for decisive combat. This stinging, dancing, infuriating harassment tests their discipline to breaking point. Richard has prepared for exactly this. He's issued strict orders. Maintain formation, ignore the harassment, continue marching. Any knight who breaks ranks to chase Muslim cavalry will be severely punished. Richard understands that his army's strength lies in cohesion. If formations hold, if cavalry charges only when he orders, if discipline prevails over anger, the Muslims cannot win. But maintaining that discipline while being shot at for hours requires almost superhuman restraint from proud, aggressive warriors. The harassment intensifies throughout the morning. Saladin commits more cavalry to the attack, increasing pressure on Richard's rearguard, which is commanded by the Knights Hospitaller. The Hospitallers bear the brunt of Muslim arrow fire, and their horses begin falling in alarming numbers. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers sends increasingly urgent messages to Richard. His men cannot sustain this punishment much longer. They must be allowed to charge. If they don't counterattack soon, the rearguard will collapse. Richard refuses. Not yet. Hold formation. Wait for my signal. By midday, the situation reaches crisis point. The Hospitallers are suffering terrible casualties. Their horses stumble and fall, riddled with arrows. Muslim cavalry presses closer, sensing the Crusaders might break. The Grand Master sends one final message. His knights will charge with or without. Richard asks permission because remaining stationary means death. At this moment, Richard must make a split-second decision. If the Hospitallers charge without coordination, the assault will fail and likely trigger the army's disintegration. If he coordinates the charge properly, timing it perfectly, he might turn the Muslims' aggression against them. Richard makes his decision. He sounds the trumpets, the signal for general assault. Not just the Hospitallers, but the entire army's cavalry will charge simultaneously. It's a calculated risk. If the charge fails, if Muslim forces withdraw successfully, Richard's army will be scattered and vulnerable. But if it succeeds, if the charge strikes while Muslim cavalry is close enough to be caught, the battle could be won decisively. The Crusader charge at Arsuf becomes legendary. Approximately 1,000 knights in full armor, mounted on powerful war horses, lower their lances and thunder forward in coordinated formations. The ground shakes with the impact of thousands of hoofs. The psychological effect on Saladin's cavalry is immediate and devastating. Muslim chroniclers describe the charge as a wall of steel moving with irresistible force. Cavalry units that moments before were confidently harassing Crusader flanks suddenly find themselves facing the full weight of European heavy cavalry at full gallop. The Muslim left flank collapses almost immediately. Crusader knights smash through light cavalry like a hammer through glass. Saladin's carefully organized formations dissolve into chaos. Individual warriors fight bravely, but coordinated resistance becomes impossible when enemy cavalry is among you. Swinging swords and maces with the momentum of charging war horses behind them. The Muslim right and center attempt to maintain cohesion, but the speed and shock of Richard's charge disrupts Saladin's entire battle plan. For several hours, the battle devolves into swirling cavalry combat across the plains near Arsuf. Richard personally leads charges, his height and red hair making him conspicuous, his martial skill keeping him alive through multiple close combats. He's everywhere on the battlefield, rallying units, exploiting openings, preventing Muslim forces from regrouping. His leadership is extraordinary. He combines personal courage with tactical awareness, knowing when to press attacks and when to reform his knights for another charge. Saladin attempts to stabilize his lines, but the initial shock has been too severe. By late afternoon, he orders a general withdrawal. It's not a rout Muslim forces retreat in relatively good order, and Saladin's cavalry screens prevent Crusader pursuit from becoming a massacre. But it's clearly a defeat. The first time Richard and Saladin have met in direct battle, and Richard has won decisively. The Battle of Arsuf cost Saladin perhaps 7,000 casualties, though numbers in medieval chronicles are notoriously unreliable. More importantly, it costs him the aura of invincibility he built through years of victories. Richard's casualties are relatively light, perhaps 700 dead, many of them from the earlier harassment rather than the decisive charge. But the victory's strategic impact exceeds the tactical results. The entire Crusader army sees that Saladin can be beaten in direct confrontation. European morale soars. More importantly, Muslim morale suffers. Saladin's emirs begin questioning whether continuing the war serves their interests, whether the cost in lives and treasure is worth defending cities the Sultan only recently captured. Richard continues his march and captures Jaffa within days, securing a port closer to Jerusalem and demonstrating the momentum from Arsuf. But as he approaches within striking distance of Jerusalem, strategic realities impose themselves. Jerusalem, perched in the Judean hills, is not a coastal city he can supply by ship. Marching an army inland means extending vulnerable supply lines. The city's fortifications, strengthened by Saladin after its capture, are formidable. And most problematically, Richard receives intelligence that Saladin is scorching the countryside around Jerusalem, destroying food sources, poisoning wells, doing everything possible to make a siege unsustainable. Richard faces the same calculation that Saladin faced at Tyre. He could besiege Jerusalem, but success is uncertain and would cost months and enormous casualties. Even if he captures the city, holding it permanently without controlling the surrounding territory seems impossible. His army consists largely of Crusaders who will return to Europe once Jerusalem is retaken. They've fulfilled their vows, garrisoning Jerusalem adequately while Saladin's forces roam the countryside would require more troops than Richard has available. In November 1191, Richard makes the painful decision to pause his advance on Jerusalem. Instead, he'll consolidate Crusader control of the coast, rebuild fortifications at key cities, and potentially return to Jerusalem in spring when conditions are more favorable. It's strategically sound but politically disastrous. Many Crusaders feel betrayed. They came to liberate Jerusalem, not to capture coastal cities. Some French nobles, already resentful of English leadership, openly question Richard's commitment to the Crusades' core mission. Dissension spreads through the army. Through the winter of 1191 to 92, Richard engages in a strange dance with Saladin. They're still at war, still competing for strategic advantage, yet they also begin negotiating. Messengers travel between the armies, carrying proposals and counter-proposals for peace. Richard suggests his sister Joan could marry Saladin's brother Aladil, with the couple ruling a unified kingdom of Jerusalem that would include both Christians and Muslims. Saladin receives the proposal with interest, though both leaders probably recognize it's more diplomatic theater than serious policy. The negotiations serve both sides' needs. Richard wants time to consolidate coastal holdings. Saladin wants to prevent another march on Jerusalem while dealing with growing financial and political pressure from prolonged war. The winter also brings a bitter succession dispute to a head. Guy de Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat both claim to be king of Jerusalem. Guy argues he was legitimately crowned before Jerusalem fell, and Sibylla, his wife and source of legitimacy, has since died. Conrad argues that Guy's military failures lost the kingdom and that he, Conrad, saved what remains through his defense of Tyre. Richard supports Guy. Partly from political calculation, Guy is weaker and more easily controlled. The French nobles and most local barons support Conrad, recognizing his superior competence. The dispute poisons Crusader politics throughout the winter. In April 1192, Richard tries again to march on Jerusalem. He advances to within 12 miles of the city, close enough that scouts can see Jerusalem's walls. But the same problems resurface: inadequate supplies, Saladin's scorched earth tactics, and the grim realization that even capturing Jerusalem wouldn't secure permanent control. After days of agonizing deliberation, Richard orders another retreat. Many Crusaders weep openly as they turn away from the city they came so far to liberate. Meanwhile, Conrad is assassinated by assassins, members of a fanatical Islamic sect that eliminates political targets through stealth killings. Whether they acted at Saladin's instigation, Richard's, or independently remains historically uncertain. Conrad's death eliminates the succession dispute, but leaves a bitter taste. Henry of Champagne, a French noble and Richard's nephew, marries Conrad's widow and becomes the new king of Jerusalem almost immediately, in an arrangement that satisfies neither English nor French factions completely, but prevents civil war. By summer 1192, both Richard and Saladin are exhausted. Richard receives urgent news from England. His brother John is consolidating power, potentially threatening Richard's throne. He needs to return home before his absence costs him his kingdom. Saladin faces similar pressures. His treasury is depleted. His emirs are restless. The territories he conquered in 1187 to 88 require administrative attention. Neither leader has achieved his ultimate goal. Richard hasn't recaptured Jerusalem. Saladin hasn't expelled the Crusaders, but neither can afford prolonged war. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, formalizes the stalemate. The Crusaders keep the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Saladin keeps Jerusalem and the interior. Christian pilgrims receive guaranteed safe passage to Jerusalem. Both sides agree to a 3-year truce. It's a compromise that satisfies no one completely, but exhausts everyone enough that it's accepted. Richard departs the Holy Land on October 9, 1192, never having achieved his goal of liberating Jerusalem, but having restored Crusader control of enough territory to ensure their survival. Chapter 11. Saladin's Legacy, March 4th, 1193, Damascus. Saladin lies dying in his palace, victim of a fever that has racked his body for days. He's 55 years old, and the constant campaigning, political stress, and physical toll of 2 decades of warfare have weakened him to the point where this illness, which might have been survivable years earlier, is now killing him. His physicians can do nothing. His family gathers around him. His emirs wait nervously outside, wondering what his death will mean for the empire he built. The fever takes Saladin slowly, giving him time to settle affairs. He dictates final instructions about dividing his territories among his sons and brother. He orders his treasurer to distribute money to the poor so much that the treasury must borrow funds to pay for. Saladin has owned funeral because the Sultan has given away virtually everything he owned. It's a final demonstration of the piety and generosity that made him beloved by many Muslims. On March 4th, after 12 days of illness, Saladin dies. The news spreads quickly through Damascus, then throughout the Muslim world and eventually to Europe. One of the medieval era's most significant leaders is gone. Saladin's death reveals both the strength and fragility of what he built. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded continues. His relatives rule Egypt, Syria, and other territories for decades. but the unified command he imposed fragments almost immediately. His brother Al-Adil eventually consolidates power, but the process takes years and involves internal conflicts that weaken Muslim resistance to future crusades. Saladin held his coalition together through personal charisma, diplomatic skill, and military success. Without him, the centrifugal forces of medieval politics reassert themselves. Yet Saladin's strategic achievements endure. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands and will for centuries. The Crusader states never recover their pre-Hattin strength. They survive in reduced form, clinging to coastal cities, dependent on European reinforcements, never again threatening Muslim control of the interior. Subsequent crusades, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and beyond, achieved temporary successes, but cannot reverse Saladin's fundamental accomplishment. He broke Crusader military dominance and reduced them from conquerors to embattled colonists. How did Saladin defeat the Crusaders? The answer lies in understanding his multifaceted approach. First and most fundamentally, he unified Muslim territories. The Crusaders succeeded initially because they faced divided opposition. Muslim states competed with each other as much as they resisted Christian invaders. Saladin spent years systematically absorbing Egypt, Syria, and northern Iraq under his personal rule. This gave him resources no previous Muslim leader commanded: the agricultural wealth of Egypt, the strategic position of Syria, and military manpower these territories provided. Unity was his foundation. Second, Saladin exploited Crusader political weaknesses ruthlessly. He understood that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was factionally divided, that its nobility feuded constantly, that succession crises paralyzed decision-making. When Reynald de Châtillon provided provocations that justified war, Saladin used them brilliantly to unite his followers behind religious rather than purely political objectives. When King Guy made the catastrophic decision to march toward Tiberias, Saladin was ready with a trap, because he understood Crusader psychology: their pride, their inability to refuse combat, their political need to appear brave even when prudence dictated caution. Third, Saladin was a master of medieval siege warfare and logistics. After Hattin eliminated the Crusader field army, he moved with stunning speed to reduce fortresses before defenders could organize. He understood when to assault and when to negotiate, when to show mercy to encourage surrender, and when to make examples that terrified others into submission. The fall of fortress after fortress in 1187 wasn't luck, it was systematic application of military pressure combined with psychological warfare and shrewd offering of terms that made resistance seem futile. Fourth, Saladin built institutions that outlasted his victories. He didn't just conquer territory. He established administration to hold it. He appointed governors, reorganized taxation, patronized religious scholars, and built madrasas and mosques that legitimized Muslim rule. When Crusaders later attempted to recapture territory, they found not just military resistance, but established social and political structures that made permanent reconquest nearly impossible. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Saladin recognized the limits of military power. After Hattin and Jerusalem, he could have pursued total annihilation of Crusader presence, but that would have required years of costly sieges and potentially triggered unlimited European commitment to the Crusades. Instead, he accepted the partial victory of Richard's coastal strip, understanding that reduced Crusader states posed manageable threats while allowing him to consolidate control over the interior and Jerusalem. The Treaty of Jaffa represented pragmatic acceptance that complete victory was impossible, but his partial victory achieved the strategic objective of ensuring Jerusalem remained Muslim. Saladin's reputation grew enormously after his death, particularly in Europe. Christian writers began portraying him as the ideal of chivalric virtue: brave, generous, honorable, the noble enemy against whom fighting was glorious rather than merely brutal. This romanticization obscures historical reality in some ways. Saladin could be ruthless when necessary, the executions of captured Templars and Hospitallers after Hattin, the occasional broken promises, the sometimes cynical manipulation of religious sentiment for political purposes. But the European idealization reflects genuine respect for his accomplishments and character. He defeated Crusader armies but treated defeated populations with surprising mercy. He was devout but tolerant. He was politically calculating but personally generous. In the Muslim world, Saladin becomes heroic in different ways. He's remembered as the liberator of Jerusalem, the champion of jihad, the leader who reversed decades of Christian dominance. Modern Arab nationalism embraces him as a symbol of resistance to Western imperialism, drawing direct parallels between Crusaders and contemporary Western powers. This political use of Saladin's memory sometimes oversimplifies the complex medieval reality. He was Kurdish, not Arab. He fought other Muslims as often as Crusaders. His empire fragmented quickly after his death. But the symbolic power of his achievements transcends historical nuance. The military lessons of Saladin's campaigns influenced warfare for centuries. His victory at Hattin demonstrated the danger of allowing armies to become separated from water sources and supply lines. His systematic reduction of fortresses after Hattin showed the importance of immediately exploiting field victories before enemies could recover. His recognition that political unity was prerequisite for military success influenced later Muslim leaders facing external threats. The limits he encountered, particularly against Richard at Arsuf and throughout the stalemate of 1191–92, demonstrated that determined, well-led European armies could still challenge Muslim forces even after Hattin. The broader historical impact of Saladin's victories reshaped Christendom and the Islamic world. For Christians, the loss of Jerusalem triggered theological crisis. How could God allow his holy city to fall to infidels again? The failure of multiple crusades, despite enormous expenditure of resources and lives, gradually convinced European leaders that permanent control of the Levant was impossible. Crusading continued for centuries, but the unlimited optimism of the early Crusades never returned. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, Christian Crusaders attacking and looting a Christian city, symbolized how far the movement had degraded from its original purpose. For Muslims, Saladin's victories vindicated military jihad as a unifying force. They demonstrated that divided Muslim states could fall to external enemies, but unified Muslim power could resist and defeat even the most fearsome Christian warriors. This lesson influenced Islamic political thought for centuries. However, Saladin's empire's rapid fragmentation after his death also demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining unity without extraordinary leadership. The tensions between theoretical Islamic unity and practical political fragmentation that characterized Saladin's era continue influencing Middle Eastern politics today. On March 7, 1193, 3 days after Saladin's death, his funeral procession moves through Damascus. Thousands of mourners crowd the streets. Rich and poor alike weep for the Sultan who ruled them with unexpected justice and who restored Jerusalem to Muslim control. His body is interred in a mausoleum near the Umayyad Mosque. According to tradition, after his death, his treasury contained so little money that funds must be borrowed to pay for the funeral. Saladin has given everything away. A man who controlled one of the medieval world's wealthiest empires dies essentially penniless, having distributed his personal fortune to the poor and to fund religious institutions. It's the final demonstration of the character that made him legendary. The question, how did Saladin defeat the Crusaders, demands a complex answer because the defeat was never total and the victory was never complete. The Crusader presence in the Levant continued for another century after Saladin's death, but measured against his core strategic objectives, liberating Jerusalem, breaking Crusader military dominance, and establishing Muslim control over the interior, Saladin succeeded brilliantly. His success came not from a single cause, but from masterful integration of multiple factors: political unification, military competence, psychological warfare, logistical expertise, and understanding when to fight and when to negotiate. The story of Saladin and the Crusaders is ultimately about the limits of military power and the importance of political cohesion. The Crusaders in 1186 had everything except unity: formidable warriors, strong fortifications, geographic position, and technological advantages. They lost everything except coastal footholds because their political divisions allowed a unified enemy to defeat them in detail. Saladin in 1193 had achieved strategic victory, but not total conquest, because even unified Muslim forces couldn't completely expel determined European armies backed by maritime logistics and constant reinforcement. The human dimension of this conflict remains striking across 8 centuries. Saladin and Richard never met face to face, yet they developed mutual respect. Both were products of their time, deeply religious, personally brave, politically calculating, and capable of great mercy and great brutality depending on circumstances. Their conflict shaped the medieval world and continues influencing how Christians and Muslims understand their historical relationship. The Crusades remain living history in ways that many medieval conflicts do not, partly because Saladin and Richard gave the struggle a human face that transcended mere political or religious abstraction. For modern audiences, Saladin's story offers lessons about leadership, strategy, and the interplay between military and political power. He demonstrated that unity of command and purpose defeats superior individual capabilities when those capabilities lack coordination. He showed that treating defeated enemies with unexpected mercy can be more strategically valuable than vengeance. He proved that lasting victory requires building institutions, not just winning battles. And he illustrated that even the most brilliant leader cannot completely transcend the structural limitations of his time. Saladin defeated the Crusaders but couldn't create political structures that would maintain unity after his death. The shadow Saladin cast over history extends far beyond his actual lifetime. For centuries after, both Christians and Muslims used example Christians as the noble enemy who made martial valor meaningful, Muslims as the liberator whose dedication to faith and justice brought victory. Modern nationalism in the Middle East invokes Saladin's memory as a symbol of resistance to Western domination. Modern scholarship tries to separate the historical figure from the legend, understanding him as a product of specific political and military circumstances rather than a timeless hero. But the legend persists because it addresses enduring questions about leadership, courage, and what makes victory meaningful beyond mere tactical success. As we look back across more than 8 centuries to Saladin's career, what emerges most clearly is the contingency of history. The Crusader defeat wasn't inevitable. Different choices at key moments might have produced radically different outcomes. If Baldwin IV had lived longer and healthier, if Raymond of Tripoli had maintained political dominance, if Guy de Lusignan had accepted Raymond's advice at Sefri, the Kingdom of Jerusalem might have survived. Similarly, Saladin's success depended on his personal qualities and fortunate timing. A less skilled leader wouldn't have unified Muslim territories. A less charismatic figure wouldn't have maintained his coalition. Different European kings arriving years earlier might have changed everything. Yet despite this contingency, certain patterns emerge. Divided polities lose to unified ones, even when individually superior. Logistical excellence beats tactical brilliance when both sides have comparable technology. Mercy to defeated populations builds longer-lasting control than terror. These lessons transcend the specific medieval context and remain relevant in understanding conflict and power in any era. Saladin defeated the Crusaders through a combination of political genius, military competence, strategic patience, and tactical opportunism, but above all, through recognizing that permanent victory requires more than battlefield success. It requires building something that outlasts the builder. The Crusades continued long after Saladin died, but they never regained their early momentum. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusader kingdoms never recovered their former strength, and gradually, European commitment to maintaining eastern outposts faded. By 1291, when Acre, the last major Crusader city, fell to Muslim forces, the era of Crusader dominance was definitively over. That ending began at Hattin in 1187, when a Kurdish general who arrived in Egypt as a junior officer destroyed the kingdom of Jerusalem's army and set in motion the sequence of events that would restore Muslim control of the Levant. Saladin didn't destroy the Crusader presence completely, but he broke its power permanently. In that sense, he achieved exactly what he set out to accomplish, and history remembers him accordingly.